He stood at the front of that room like a man who had been rehearsing for weeks. Maybe he had. I watched him take the microphone from the band leader with the easy confidence of someone who had spent 30 years walking into rooms and commanding them. He thanked the guests. He named a few people. He made a joke about time moving fast. The room laughed, glasses lifted, and for 40 seconds, it looked like an anniversary speech. Then he turned and looked directly at me. The warmth left his face the way heat leaves a room when a door opens in winter. Slow enough that you feel it before you understand it. He said, and I will not soften what he said, that 30 years was enough. That he wanted a young white woman. That he was done with an old black hag like me. Into a microphone, in front of 60 people, on our anniversary. Waverly laughed first. 2 of Elton's friends followed, that particular sound men make when they are performing approval for each other. Somewhere behind me, a glass was set down carefully, the way people handle things when their hands are unsteady. The pastor who joined us in marriage 30 years ago did not move. Celestine, sitting to my left, turned toward me with something in her eyes I had no time to read. My name is Cora Adams. I built a funeral services company from the ground up in this city, and the man standing at that microphone has worked for me for 27 years. I want you to hold that thought. Before I go further, if you are watching this and you know someone who needs to hear a story about a woman who was not caught off guard, tell them to pull up a chair. Drop in the comments and let me know where in the world you are watching from. I want to know who is in this room with me tonight. I sat still for a long moment after Elton finished speaking. Long enough that the laughter died. Long enough that the silence became its own kind of pressure and people stopped knowing where to look. I have learned over the years that stillness unsettles people far more than noise ever could. Then I stood. I walked toward Elton and I took the microphone from his hand. Not pulled it, not snatched it. Took it, the way you retrieve something that was always yours. He let go without thinking because in 27 years he'd been trained to hand things over when I extended my hand. I did not raise my voice. I told the room that the building we were sitting in belonged to me. Not jointly, not partly, solely. Held in a single-member LLC I established before our wedding date. I told them the apartment Elton had moved into after our marriage was mine as well, purchased years before he ever proposed. I told them the car he drove here tonight was registered to one of my companies. I told them the tab for the evening was covered in full, and I hoped everyone would enjoy the rest of the night because the kitchen was still open. Then I told them the fourth thing. Elton's employment contract with Adams Funeral Services had been renewed 6 weeks ago on his standard 3-year cycle. Under the terms of that contract, this evening marked the beginning of his 90-day notice period. I set the microphone down on the table in front of him. I returned to my seat. I did not look at him again for the rest of the evening. Not because I was hurt, because there was nothing left to see. He had walked into that room believing he was ending a marriage. He had not known until I spoke that he was also ending his employment. The expression on his face in the moment between my third sentence and my fourth told me everything I needed to know about how little he had actually understood about his own position. He thought he knew what he owned. He had never once read his own contract. The morning after the anniversary dinner, I did not call a lawyer. I did not call Celestine. I went to my storage room, pulled a cardboard box from the second shelf, and sat on the floor with it in my lap until the sun came through the window. Inside that box were 11 composition books. Black covers, college-ruled, edges soft from handling. My mother's handwriting filled every page. Vernell Adams never owned a funeral home. She never applied for a license, never signed a lease, never put her name on any storefront in the 3rd Ward. What she did was quieter than that, and far more necessary. When a family in our neighborhood lost someone and had nowhere to turn, because the grief was too raw, because the money was too thin, because the funeral homes that existed in Houston in those years made Black families feel like an inconvenience. They came to my mother. She prepared bodies in the back room of our house. She coordinated burial arrangements through a network of contacts she had built one relationship at a time over 20 years. She sat with families through the night when they needed someone who would not rush them toward a bill. She charged what people could pay. Sometimes that was $60. Sometimes it was a covered dish left on our porch and a thank you she never required. But she kept records of everything. Every family. Every arrangement. Every dollar that came in and every dollar that went out. 11 composition books. 30 years of the Third Ward's grief, written in a hand so precise it looked like she expected someone to audit her one day. I used to think that precision was just who she was. A woman who believed that the work of caring for the dead deserved the same rigor as any other serious business. I understood later that she was building something, even when she had no legal framework to build inside. She was laying a foundation in the only material she had: documentation, relationship, and an absolute refusal to treat any family as less than worthy of care. What I could never fully reconcile, even as a child sitting beside her while she worked, was the money. Not the income from families. I understood that. The composition books accounted for every dollar of it. What I could not reconcile was the gap between what those books recorded and what my mother actually had. The numbers did not match in the way that accumulation and discipline alone could explain. There was more, not dramatically more, but enough that I noticed it the first time I sat down to understand what we actually had. I was 19 years old. My mother was still living and I was trying, with the careful seriousness of a young woman who had decided she was going to do something real with what her mother had built, to understand our financial position. I went through her bank records the way she had taught me to go through everything, slowly, with attention. There was a deposit, a single lump sum, dated 1987 when I was 13 years old. The amount was significant. The origin was listed only as a transfer from an attorney's escrow account. No name, no explanation attached. I asked her about it that evening. She was at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, and she looked at me the way she looked at things she had already decided about. She said it was from an old arrangement. She said it simply, without elaboration, and then she asked me whether I wanted dinner. I did not push. I was 19 and she was my mother, and her hands had never done anything I had reason to question. So I filed it in the part of my mind reserved for things I was not yet ready to understand. I left it there for 32 years. Sitting on that storage room floor the morning after my husband humiliated me in public, holding her composition books, I understood for the first time that my mother had kept more than grief records. She had kept secrets too. The loan officer's name was printed on a small plastic placard on his desk, and I have never forgotten it, though I have no intention of saying it here. What I will say is that he reviewed my folder for 11 minutes, asked me one question about projected revenue, and told me the numbers were not sufficient to support the loan amount I was requesting. 11 minutes. My mother had spent 30 years building the client base those numbers represented, and he needed 11 minutes to decide it did not qualify. I thanked him. I picked up my folder. I walked toward the elevator with the particular composure of a woman who has learned that falling apart in the wrong room is a luxury she cannot afford. The elevator doors were about to close when a hand came through and stopped them. He was younger than I expected from someone in a suit that well fitted. He said his name was Elton Briggs, and that he worked at that branch, though he wanted me to know his last day was Friday, so what he was about to say carried no obligation to the bank in either direction. He had watched my meeting from across the floor. He had seen my folder. He told me the loan officer was wrong. I looked at him for a moment. Then I stepped back out of the elevator. We walked to a diner around the corner and we sat across from each other for 2 hours. He went through my numbers the way someone goes through a document they find genuinely interesting. Not to be helpful, but because the problem had engaged him. He identified 3 places where my projections were actually conservative, not aggressive, and explained specifically how a different presentation of the same data would have supported the loan amount rather than undermined it. He was not performing expertise. He had it. I watched him talk, and I was doing 2 things at once. The first was listening, because what he was saying was useful, and I did not waste useful things. The second was something I did not name to myself that afternoon, but understood clearly enough. I was watching a man who spoke the language of the rooms I needed to enter, who sat in those rooms without apology, who knew how to take the thing I had built and translate it into terms that made other men want to be involved. I had the business. I had the numbers. I had 30 years of my mother's foundation underneath me. What I did not have was fluency in the language those particular rooms required. Elton Briggs had that fluency, and he did not yet know I was already thinking about what it was worth. What I did not anticipate, and I want to be honest about this, was him, not his usefulness. Him, the way he listened when I spoke about what my mother had built, not with the polite attention people perform when they are waiting for their turn to talk, but with the specific stillness of someone who understood that what he was hearing mattered. He asked about her, not about the business model, about her, what she was like, what she had believed about the work. Nobody had ever asked me that in a business conversation. We closed the diner down that evening. He walked me to my car. He asked if he could call me, and I told him he could. I drove home thinking about projections and presentation strategies and the precise way his attention had felt when it landed on me. I did not let myself think too long about that last part, but I thought about it. The man I married 3 years later was not a villain in the beginning. I need you to understand that. What he was, in that diner, on that evening, was exactly what he appeared to be. The question I have spent 30 years answering is when that changed. 3 years into our marriage, I sat across from a man in a downtown Houston office who had reviewed my expansion proposal for a 3rd time and still could not find a reason to say yes, that he was comfortable saying out loud. He was polite about it. They were always polite. He used words like timing and market saturation and risk profile, and I sat there and translated every one of them into the word he would not use. I drove home and I made a decision. The business had 2 locations by then. I had my license, my staff, my client relationships, and numbers that any honest analyst would have called conservative. What I did not have was a face that those particular rooms responded to. I had tested that theory enough times to stop calling it a theory. It was simply the condition I was operating inside, and I was done losing ground to it. Elton was at the kitchen table when I got home. I sat down across from him and I told him what I needed. Not what I wanted, what I needed, specifically, and what it would require from him. I needed him to become the public face of Adam's Funeral Services. To attend investor meetings, sign certain correspondence, and represent the company in rooms where my presence had consistently produced a particular kind of hesitation. I would remain the architect of everything. He would be the door. He was quiet for a moment. Then he asked me one question. He asked if I was sure. I told him I was certain. He said he would do it. What I built around that arrangement was precise. Before every meeting, every pitch, every investor engagement, I wrote Elton a brief. Not notes on a napkin. A full document. The background on whoever he was meeting. The specific business case framed in the language I knew that room would receive. The terms I would accept. The terms I would not accept under any framing. The questions he should ask. The responses he should give to likely objections. He studied those briefs the way he had once studied for bank examinations. Seriously, completely, without shortcuts. He went into every room prepared because I had prepared him. He came home and reported back with the same thoroughness. I filed every brief by date, by investor, by outcome. 31 of them over the years that followed. The meetings started producing results inside 6 months. I want to be precise about what I understood when I designed that arrangement and what I did not. I understood that I was using the access his presence provided. I understood that the investors shaking his hand were responding to something I could not offer them, and that this was not his fault or mine. It was simply the architecture of the rooms we were trying to enter. What I told myself and what I believed was that the arrangement was temporary, that as the business grew and established itself, my direct involvement would become less complicated for those rooms to accept. What I did not fully account for was what the arrangement would do to Elton over time. In the beginning, he knew exactly what he was. He would come home from a meeting, sit across from me, and debrief with the precision of someone who understood his role completely. He was executing my strategy. He knew it, and I knew it, and the clarity between us felt like trust. But there is something that happens to a man who spends years being thanked, congratulated, and deferred to for work that originated somewhere else. Something quiet and gradual that does not announce itself. I saw the first sign of it in year 5, at a dinner with 2 investors who had just committed to our 3rd location expansion. One of them raised a glass to Elton and said the business would not be what it was without him. Elton smiled and said thank you. He did not look at me when he said it. Elton came home from the final meeting with Harlan Spite's group and told me it was over. 18 months of proposals, revisions, follow-up meetings, and revised projections, and the answer was no. He sat across from me at the kitchen table and delivered the news with the particular flatness of a man who had expected it. The land was valuable. The deal was sound. The numbers were right. He did not say what we both understood about why the answer was still no. He did not need to. I had been translating that particular silence for years. I told him to let it go. We would find another parcel. I went to bed. What I did not know was that Elton did not let it go. He went back to Spite privately, not immediately. He waited 2 weeks, which tells me he thought about it carefully before he moved. He met with Spite twice over 6 weeks. I know this now with the precision of documented fact, though I did not know it then. What I know is that he closed the deal. The cemetery land acquisition went through. He came home one evening and told me a contact had reconsidered, that the terms had shifted favorably, that we should move forward. He presented it as a development, a piece of good news. I remember being pleased. I remember thinking that his relationships in those rooms had finally produced something real without a brief from me driving it. I remember being wrong about what I was looking at. What I eventually learned was that Spite had not reconsidered because the numbers improved. The numbers had always worked. He reconsidered because Elton gave him something he had not previously been offered. What Elton had done, what I would not discover for another 18 months, was offer Harlan Spite a silent equity arrangement. A percentage of future Adams Funeral Services revenue paid quarterly to a holding company inside Spite's portfolio. He had not documented it inside our core business accounts. He had set it up through a Houston attorney he retained without telling me, under a company he named Briggs Management Consulting. Nothing in our primary ledgers connected to Spite directly. The payments routed from a subsidiary account into Briggs Management Consulting and from there outward. Clean on the surface, buried underneath. I have spent years thinking about why he did it. Not because the answer changes anything, but because understanding matters. By that point, Elton had spent years being the man who walked into rooms and came back with results. The acquisition had become his project, his relationship, his proof that he could open doors that stayed closed for me. When Spite said no, Elton took it personally, not as a failed transaction, as a failure. He told himself it was temporary. I know this because I know the kind of man who does something like this. Not a cruel man. Not a calculating one in the beginning, but a man who wanted to solve a problem that was embarrassing him and told himself the solution was short-term and the explanation could wait until things settled. He likely believed he would tell me after the acquisition closed, after the revenue increased, after the decision looked justified by the outcome. Things did not settle. The payments continued. The explanation never came. 18 months after the acquisition closed, I was conducting my routine audit of the subsidiary accounts. I did this personally, quarterly, the way my mother kept her composition books, with full attention and no shortcuts. I found a payment line to Briggs Management Consulting. I did not recognize the name. I pulled the full subsidiary records. I found one page. Elton's signature at the bottom. Spites Holding Company named as beneficiary of a quarterly percentage of Adams Funeral Services revenue. An equity clause covering any future liquidity event. I read it once. I read it again. I placed it back exactly where I found it. I went to the kitchen and I made dinner. He came home at 6:30 and I served him his plate and I asked him how the Beaumont family consultation had gone. And he told me it had gone well. We ate. We cleaned up together. I went to bed before him and I lay in the dark and I held what I had found, the way you hold something with a sharp edge, carefully, without moving, breathing slowly until you are certain you are not going to bleed. I did not ask him about it that night. I did not ask him the next morning. I made a decision in that dark, in that quiet, that I would not ask him about it at all. Not yet. Not until I was ready. Not until asking served a purpose larger than the answer. I already had the answer. I just needed the right moment to use it. 8 years after I found that document, I retained a business attorney, not a divorce attorney. A transactional attorney. A woman named for the work of contracts and structures, not the work of endings. I gave her every document the company held and told her to review all of it and report back completely. I did not tell her what I was looking for. I wanted to know what she found on her own. She called me on a Thursday morning, 7 days into the review. She said she had found a subsidiary arrangement she wanted to discuss. She described it precisely. The shell company name, the quarterly payment structure, the equity clause. She asked me how I wanted to proceed. I told her to note it, file it, and leave it exactly where it was. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said she understood and asked no further questions. That was the quality I valued most in her. She was paid for her work and retained on a standing basis from that point forward. She never raised the arrangement again unless I raised it first. What she also gave me in that review was confirmation of something I had believed but needed documented. The original funeral home license had been issued to Vernell Adams in 1979. It transferred to me in 1991. My marriage to Elton did not occur until 1993. The formalization of Adams Funeral Services as a limited liability company in 1994 was a restructuring of a business that already existed and already belonged to me. Not a new creation built inside the marriage. Under Texas law, separate property brought into a marriage remains separate property when the documentation is clean. My documentation was clean. My attorney put that conclusion in a memo, and I filed it with the same care my mother filed names in her composition books. From that memo, I built everything else. I went through every asset, every account, every contract the company held, and I confirmed what was unambiguously mine. The pre-need portfolio, future revenue already contracted, already paid into trust, already legally committed, sat inside the original LLC. It had never been restructured to include Elton as an equity holder, because I had never restructured it that way. His employment agreement, signed in year 2 of our marriage and renewed in year 15, named him operations director with profit sharing tied to performance. It contained no equity clause. It had never contained one. I confirmed this and I filed that confirmation too. I did not fire him. I did not remove him from operations. I did not change a single visible thing about how the business ran or how our marriage appeared from the outside. He continued attending meetings. His name continued on correspondence. The business continued to grow. From any angle that was not mine, nothing had changed. Nettie Frazier said something to me during this period that I have carried since. She did not know what I was doing or why. We were closing up the original location one evening, and she said that Vernell used to tell her the right time to move was when you were ready, not when you were angry. She said it the way people pass along wisdom they absorbed, without fully knowing when they would need it. I did not respond. I locked the front door and walked to my car and sat for a moment before I started the engine. I will tell you the full truth about why I waited as long as I did. Part of it was the business. Part of it was my mother's voice coming through Nettie. And part of it, the part I am telling you last because it is the hardest part to say, was that I still loved him. Not the man he had become by then, the man he had been. The man in that diner who asked about my mother like her life was something worth understanding. That man was gone. But I had loved him, and that took time to finish. Let me tell you what I actually built, because what Elton thought he was walking away with and what I actually hold are two entirely different things. When a family comes to Adam's funeral services before a death, not after, before, and signs a pre-need contract, they are committing future revenue into a trust account today. The arrangements are made, the prices are locked, the money is held. When the death eventually occurs, the funds release to cover the services already selected. Those contracts represent income the business has already earned and will collect with certainty. They cannot be dissolved, redirected, or reached by anyone who does not hold ownership of the entity that carries them. I built that portfolio inside the original LLC, the same structure that predated my marriage, the same entity my transactional attorney confirmed as my separate property under Texas law. By the time Elton began asking questions about the founding documents, that portfolio represented the most valuable single asset the company held. Not the 6 locations, not the equipment, not the vehicles or the accounts. The pre-need portfolio. Future revenue already signed, already committed, already mine. Elton did not know the precise value of what sat inside that LLC. What he knew, or believed he knew, what he had told Waverly, what he had built his entire calculation around, was that he owned 40% of the parent company. He believed this with the confidence of a man who had repeated an assumption often enough that it began to feel like a fact. In year 12 of our marriage, Elton was approached by a competing funeral services group operating out of Dallas. They wanted him as a regional director. The compensation package was significant. He turned it down. He stayed. And that evening, in our kitchen, I told him that his commitment to what we had built would be recognized in the company's structure when the time was right. I meant it when I said it. He was the man who had just chosen us over something larger, and I wanted him to know that choice was seen. What I did not say was 40%. I did not say ownership. I did not promise equity. I promised recognition. I never papered anything because there was nothing to paper. What happened afterward was gradual enough that I did not fully appreciate it while it was happening. Investors would thank Elton for being my partner. Vendors would refer to him as co-owner. Community leaders would introduce him as the man who helped build Adam's funeral services. At dinners, conferences, and industry events, people used ownership language casually and repeatedly. In the beginning, Elton corrected them. Later, he stopped. Eventually, people spoke that way so often that neither of us interrupted anymore. I thought about it carefully over the weeks that followed, and I understood that formalizing a 40% equity transfer to Elton meant restructuring the LLC in ways that would complicate the separate property protections I had spent years building. So I made a decision, and I made it quietly, and I told myself I would find another way to honor what I had said. I found other ways. His salary, his profit sharing, his title, his autonomy inside the operations. I gave him every benefit I believed was appropriate, without transferring ownership of the business itself. By year 20, I think Elton genuinely believed the paperwork simply had not caught up to what he assumed reality already was. He attended ownership-level meetings. He negotiated major contracts. He represented the company publicly. Nobody challenged his authority because I had given him that authority. What I never gave him was equity. Somewhere along the way, Elton converted recognition into ownership. I did not correct that assumption as quickly as I should have. That is not something I am proud of. It is simply what happened. What Nettie told me on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks before the anniversary dinner was that Elton had been asking questions. Not of me, of the staff. He had approached 2 longtime employees separately and asked about the LLC founding documents, who held ownership, how the structure was organized, what the pre-need accounts were connected to. Nettie had worked at that original location since my mother's time. She understood immediately what questions like those meant, and she came to me the same day. She found me in the back office and she closed the door behind her. She said, "Cora, your husband has been asking about the paperwork." She said it simply, the way she said most things, and she watched my face. I thanked her. I told her she had done exactly right by coming to me. She nodded and left, and I sat for a moment in the quiet of that office. He was moving. He had been planning, and now he was verifying, and in 3 weeks he would stand at a microphone and say what he believed would catch me without cover. He had been asking about documents he had never once read. Celestine called me on a Wednesday morning 11 days after the anniversary dinner. She did not open with pleasantries. She said her cousin worked in the building on Westheimer where Pemberton Gale kept his offices, and that she had seen Elton in the lobby 3 days ago with a leather portfolio under his arm, and the particular expression of a man attending a meeting he considered important. She said she thought I should know. I told her she was right, and thanked her and ended the call. Pemberton Gale. I knew the name. Houston's legal community is smaller than the city suggests, and Gale had a specific reputation: high-asset divorce cases, aggressive discovery, a tendency to pursue constructive ownership arguments in cases involving family businesses. Elton had not retained a divorce attorney. He had retained a strategy. What Celestine did not know, and what I did not tell her, was that I had been expecting this for 14 months. 14 months ago, I sat down at the computer in our home office to look up a vendor invoice and found that Elton had not closed his browser. The search history was open. Divorce attorneys, Houston high asset. Texas, community property versus separate property. Constructive ownership business contribution. He had been thorough. He had searched for 2 hours on a Tuesday afternoon while I was at the Almeda location reviewing staff schedules. I did not confront him. I closed the browser exactly as I found it, and I went to make dinner, and I thought carefully about what I needed to do next and in what order. I spent the following 6 months pulling every document I had not personally reviewed recently. Employment agreements, LLC founding records, pre-need portfolio trust documentation, the original license transfer from my mother's name to mine. I confirmed everything I believed to be true, and I documented every confirmation. I needed to know precisely what I held before I placed it in anyone else's hands. After 6 months, I knew. I called Dorothea Sullins on a Thursday afternoon and retained her before the end of the business day. Dorothea had been building the case file for 8 months by the time Celestine called me about Gale's lobby. When I told her Elton had retained Pemberton Gale specifically, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said that Gale was going to lead with constructive ownership, and that this was actually preferable to other approaches, because constructive ownership arguments live and die on documentation. She said we had 31 investor briefs authored entirely by me that predated 31 relationships Elton would claim as evidence of his contribution. She said a man who has never read his own employment agreement is guessing at his net worth, and that we would let him guess in open court. I told her to proceed. That evening, Elton's brother called. My cell. Waverly's voice was warm in the way voices are warm when the warmth is doing a job. He said he was calling because he cared about the family. He used that word 3 times. Family. spaced through the conversation at intervals that felt rehearsed. He asked whether there was any way Elton and I could resolve things privately, without attorneys, without things becoming more complicated than they needed to be. I listened to every word before I responded. I told him I appreciated the call. I ended it. What I understood from the first sentence Waverly spoke was that he knew more about Elton's legal strategy than a brother calling out of genuine concern would know. The specific language he used, privately, without attorneys, without things becoming complicated, was the language of someone who had been told what outcome Elton needed and asked to produce it through the side door. Elton had sent his brother to slow me down. He still did not know he was already behind. Reginald Fuse was not a man who used unnecessary words. He arrived at Dorothea's office on a Friday morning with a bound report and a single-page summary he placed face down on the table until everyone was seated. He had been working the subsidiary accounts for 6 weeks. What he put in front of us that morning was not a theory. It was a documented transaction history with source records attached. He turned the summary page over and walked us through it without drama. The subsidiary account Elton had established through Briggs Management Consulting had been active for 23 years. Quarterly payments had moved from an Adams Funeral Services subsidiary into Briggs Management Consulting, and from there into a holding company registered to Harlan Spite. The payments were consistent. They had never missed a quarter. The total transferred over the life of the arrangement was $1.4 million. Reginald then described the equity clause. The original one-page arrangement, signed by Elton, naming Spite's holding company as beneficiary, contained a provision entitling Spite to a percentage of any liquidity event involving Adams Funeral Services. Reginald confirmed 3 things about that clause, with the flat precision of someone reading a weather report. It had never been disclosed to me. It had never been reviewed by any attorney acting on my behalf. It had never appeared in any marital financial disclosure in the history of our marriage. Dorothea wrote without looking up. I sat with my hands folded on the table and I listened to Reginald describe a document I had first read 23 years ago in my own office, alone, on a Tuesday afternoon, and returned to its place without a word. I did not say that. I asked 2 questions about the equity clause language, specifically whether the liquidity event provision would be triggered by a divorce asset division, and whether the clause had a sunset date. Reginald confirmed the provision would be triggered and that there was no sunset date. The arrangement, as written, had no expiration. It was still active. It had always been active. I thanked him for his work. He nodded and gathered his materials. After he left, Dorothea looked at me across the table. She said that what Reginald had produced gave her 2 things she had not had before. The first was a documented undisclosed liability against marital assets, the kind of financial concealment Texas courts took seriously. The second was a third party with his own legal exposure who would now need to make his own decisions about how to proceed. She said Reginald had contacted Spite directly as part of the verification process. Standard procedure, confirm the receiving party acknowledges the arrangement. Spite had acknowledged it. He was elderly now and had collected on the arrangement for 23 years without incident or interference. When Reginald explained that the arrangement was likely to become relevant to a contested divorce proceeding, Spite did not argue. He asked for copies of the documentation. 3 days later, his attorney requested the same records independently. Within the week, Spite had retained counsel to review his position and determine whether the original agreement had exposed him to liabilities he had never been asked to consider. I sat with that for a moment. Harlan Spite, who had refused my cemetery proposal 25 years ago in a room where the rejection required no explanation, was now retaining counsel because of a decision Elton made without telling me. The arrangement Elton designed to solve a problem I was not supposed to know about had become a problem I was not required to solve. Dorothea asked me if I had any other questions. I told her I did not. I picked up my bag and I walked out of that office and I sat in my car in the parking structure for 4 minutes before I started the engine. 23 years I had carried that document in silence. I had never said what I knew to anyone. I had decided, in a quiet bedroom on a Tuesday night, that the court would be the first voice to name it. In 2 weeks, the court would name it. The night before the first proceeding, Nettie called and asked me to come by the original location. It was past 8 in the evening, and her voice had the particular quality of someone who had decided to say something they had been holding for a long time. I drove over and found her in Vernell's old back room, sitting in the chair my mother used to sit in when she was finishing paperwork late. She told me that sometime in the early years of the business, she believed it was the 8th or 9th year of my marriage, a man had come to the funeral home asking questions. Not Harlan Spite, a representative. He had presented himself as conducting due diligence on behalf of a business associate, and he had asked one of the front staff about the ownership structure of Adams Funeral Services. Who held the LLC? Whether there were other principals. The staff member had referred him to Vernell, who was in that day. Vernell had spoken with him briefly, asked him 2 questions, and sent him away. Afterward, Vernell had come to find Nettie. She had said, quietly and without elaboration, that Elton had done something foolish and that Cora would find it when she was ready to find it. Then she had gone back to work and never raised it again. I sat with that for a long moment in my mother's chair. She had known. She had seen it, assessed it, and made a decision that was entirely consistent with everything I understood about who she was. She did not protect me from it by removing it. She trusted me to reach it in my own time. She had been gone for 11 years by the time Reginald Fuse put a bound report on Dorothea's table, but she had seen the shape of what Elton did before I found the document myself. I did not cry. I thanked Nettie and I drove home and I laid out my clothes for the morning. I carried my mother into that courtroom with me. Elton's attorney opened with 30 years. That was the architecture of the argument. 3 decades of operational presence, investor relationships cultivated personally, revenue growth sustained under his leadership. He was claiming constructive ownership and his presentation was organized and confident. I will say what I have said before. Elton's contribution was real. The relationships were real. The growth was real. His attorney built a credible case from credible materials. Then Dorothea stood up. She placed 31 documents on the record, 31 investor briefs written by me, each one dated, each one naming the specific investor Elton would subsequently contact, each one containing the business case, the acceptable terms, the language to use, and the questions to ask. She presented them chronologically. The first investor Elton had named in his deposition, a man he had described as a relationship he built independently over 18 months, had a corresponding brief dated 6 weeks before Elton's first contact with him. The pattern held across all 31. Elton's attorney asked Judge Odom for time to review. She gave him 15 minutes. During those 15 minutes, I sat at the table and I thought about my mother in that back room, sending a stranger away, and then finding Nettie and saying what she said. She had protected the business the only way she could without stepping into a marriage that was not hers to enter. I thought about the 11 years between her saying it and me finding the document, and the 23 years between finding the document and sitting in this courtroom. When the recess ended, Elton's attorney requested additional time to confer with his client regarding the newly introduced documents. Judge Odom granted 10 minutes. I watched Elton's face. In 30 years of marriage, I had learned to read it with precision. His attorney turned pages, pointed to dates, spoke quietly. Elton said almost nothing. When they returned to counsel table, the confidence that had opened the morning was gone. 4 minutes later, Dorothea introduced Reginald's report. I watched Elton's face again. What crossed it in the moment, his attorney leaned down and said something quietly into his ear, was not anger. It was the specific expression of a man who has just understood that the ground he was standing on was never what he thought it was. His attorney requested a full recess. Judge Odom granted 30 minutes. Reginald called and asked if he could come by the house rather than the office. That was the first signal. In 6 weeks of working together, he had never made that request. I told him to come at 4 o'clock, and I made sure I was alone when he arrived. He sat across from me at the kitchen table with a single folder. Not the bound report he had brought to Dorothea's office. One folder, 3 pages inside. He said that at Dorothea's instruction he had traced the original capital, the 1987 deposit in my mother's account, and that what he found was not complicated legally, but was personal in a way he thought I deserved to hear privately. I told him to go ahead. The deposit had originated from a Houston attorney's escrow account. The attorney had been deceased since 1994. In his active years, he had specialized in estate administration, the orderly closing of lives on paper, the distribution of what people left behind. The funds Reginald traced were the residual proceeds of a small estate belonging to a family named Cutler, a Houston family. The last surviving Cutler heir had died in the spring of 1987 with no living relatives and a modest estate that covered legal fees, 2 small bequests to a church and a neighbor, and 1 additional beneficiary named in a handwritten codicil attached to the will. Reginald was careful about one thing. He made it clear the estate was not enormous. It was meaningful, not transformative. Enough to help someone start something. Not enough to build 6 funeral homes, a cemetery development, and a multi-generational business empire. That part came later. That part came from decades of work. Reginald explained that handwritten codicils were used in that period with some regularity precisely because they allowed a testator to add someone outside the formal document, someone a family attorney might question, or delay, or find reason to complicate. A handwritten codicil, signed and dated by the testator, carried legal weight in Texas without requiring the same formal process as the original will. It was a way of making sure a particular person received what the testator intended, without interference. The Cutler family had employed my mother as a domestic worker for 11 years. The sole beneficiary named in that codicil was Vernell Adams. I did not speak for a long moment. Reginald did not fill the silence. He understood, I think, that some information requires space before it can be absorbed properly. My mother had worked in that house for 11 years. She had done what she did in every space she ever occupied. She had shown up completely, done the work with full attention, and treated the people she served as though their lives had weight and meaning. Somewhere in 11 years of that, a relationship had formed that a dying person decided to honor in the most private way available to them, not publicly. Not in the main body of a document that family attorneys would review. In a handwritten edition, added 6 months before death, that said in legal terms what could not be said any other way. I thought about my mother changing the subject in our kitchen in 1987 when I asked about the deposit. She had not lied to me. She had said it was from an old arrangement and she had been correct. What she had protected was not the money. The money was documented, traceable, clean. What she had protected was the relationship behind it. Whatever those 11 years had contained, whatever had passed between my mother and the last of that family, she had kept it as her own. She had taken the inheritance, used it as seed money, built something with it, and never asked me to carry the story of where it came from. I asked Reginald whether the probate record was accessible. He said it existed in a Harris County courthouse archive, paper only, not digitally indexed. Findable by someone who knew exactly what they were looking for and was willing to request physical records. In practical terms, private. I told him to ensure the Cutler name appeared in no current court filings. He said he would handle it. He closed the folder and I walked him to the door and I stood in the entrance of my house after he left. And I thought about a woman who carried a kindness from an unlikely place and used it to begin something that outlasted everyone who ever doubted her. I came from that. The money started it. My mother built the rest. The final settlement hearing was in the morning. I drove to the original location that evening without calling ahead because I knew Nettie would be there. She closed up every Thursday herself, had done it for 31 years. And some people's rhythms are so consistent that you can set your life against them without asking permission. She was locking the supply room when I came through the back. She looked at me once, took in whatever my face was doing, and said she would put the kettle on. That was Nettie. No performance of concern. Just the immediate, practical response of a woman who understood what people needed before they said it. I sat at the small table in the back room. The same table my mother had used, the same 4 chairs, the same window that looked out onto the side lot where the oak tree had grown wide enough now to shade the entire wall. I had brought one of Vernell's composition books. The third one, covering a span of years in the early period when the work was still entirely informal and the families had no one else to call. Nettie set the tea down and sat across from me, and I opened the book. We read through it together without rushing. Nettie knew some of the names from her own early years at the location. She would touch a name occasionally with one finger and say something small. That she remembered the family. That the grandmother had been a churchwoman. That the son had moved to Dallas and done well. I knew other names from my mother's stories. The ones she told in the particular way she had of making the dead present without making them heavy. We moved through the pages the way you move through something that deserves attention. There was a name on the 14th page that stopped us both. A family my mother had served in 1974 for whatever they could pay, which according to the composition book had been $22 and a bag of sweet potatoes. Their granddaughter had buried her husband through Adam's funeral services 3 years ago. I had handled the arrangement personally. I had not known, sitting across from that woman in my office, that her grandmother's name was in my mother's handwriting in a composition book on my second shelf at home. The work had continued. It had only changed shape. Nettie was quiet for a while after that page. Then she said that Vernell used to tell her a business built for people who need it doesn't belong to any one person, that it belongs to every family it ever served. She said it the way she said things Vernell had told her, not as a quote, but as something that had become part of her own understanding over the years, something she no longer needed to attribute because she had absorbed it completely. I took the pen from my jacket pocket and I wrote it in the margin of the composition book. Directly beside the entry for 1974, beside the $22 and the sweet potatoes. I wrote it in my own handwriting underneath my mother's. Nettie watched me do it and said nothing. We sat for another hour. We did not talk about the hearing. We did not talk about Elton or Dorothea or what the morning would produce. There was nothing left to prepare, and we both understood that. What I needed that evening was not strategy. It was this room, this table, this woman who had known my mother's hands when they were still working, and the sound of 30 years of names being held with the care they had always deserved. I left at 9:30. I drove home in the dark, and I laid my clothes out for the morning, and I slept without difficulty for the first time in weeks. I knew what I was walking into. I knew what I held. And I knew, sitting in that back room with Nettie and my mother's composition book, exactly what all of it had been for. Judge Loretta Odom ran her courtroom the way certain women run everything, with an economy of motion that communicated clearly that her time and everyone else's would be used without waste. She called the proceeding to order at 9 in the morning, and the room settled immediately. Dorothea stood and began. She placed the original sole proprietorship license on the record first, issued to Vernell Adams in 1979. She placed the transfer document beside it, Vernell to Cora, executed in 1991, 2 years before the marriage. She placed the LLC formation papers from 1994 and stated plainly that this was a restructuring of a business that already existed and already belonged to Cora Adams, not a new creation built inside the marriage. She placed Elton's employment agreement, signed in year 2, renewed in year 15, renewed again 6 weeks before the anniversary dinner. She invited the court to note that no version of that agreement, across 3 cycles spanning 25 years, contained an equity clause of any kind. She placed the pre-need portfolio documentation and confirmed it was held inside the original LLC, structurally outside the marital estate. Then she placed the 31 briefs. The documents themselves had been disclosed during discovery weeks earlier. What Dorothea introduced that morning was the complete chronology. Each brief matched directly against the investor relationship Elton had identified in deposition testimony as evidence of independent business development. She presented them chronologically, each one dated, each one identifying the specific investor by name, each one containing the complete strategy Cora had written before Elton made contact. She did not editorialize. She simply organized the record and let the dates speak. Elton's attorney asked Judge Odom for time to review. She gave him 20 minutes. I sat at the table and I kept my eyes forward. I did not look at Elton during the recess. I was aware of him the way you are aware of something in your peripheral vision that you have decided not to turn toward. When the recess ended, Elton's attorney requested a brief opportunity to confer privately with his client. Judge Odom granted 5 minutes. They stepped aside. Elton spoke very little. His attorney spoke more. What happened next did not occur because of one document or one argument. Months of discovery had narrowed the dispute considerably before we ever entered that courtroom. The chronology Dorothea presented that morning simply removed the last factual support beneath the constructive ownership theory. When they returned to the table, the constructive ownership argument was withdrawn. No amended claim substituted. No alternative ownership theory offered. Withdrawn. Dorothea then presented the Reginald Fuse report. She argued fraudulent concealment of marital liability with the same flat precision she brought to everything. She described how Elton had entered a financial arrangement that created an ongoing obligation touching Adam's funeral services assets, structured it specifically to obscure its connection to the business, and maintained it for 23 years without disclosure to his spouse or inclusion in any marital financial record. She asked Judge Odom to note the arrangement on the record and refer the matter for separate inquiry. Judge Odom made 2 notes. She referred the matter. 4 sentences from the bench, delivered without inflection. I heard movement in the gallery. I did not turn. From the edge of my vision, I saw Waverly stand, collect his jacket from the seat beside him, and move toward the door. I turned back to Judge Odom. Whatever Waverly needed to leave before hearing, I did not need to watch him carry it out. Spite's attorney was present that morning. He did not address the court. He did not file anything from counsel table. What he did was observe the proceedings, take notes, and leave with the same file he arrived carrying. Later, I would learn that the review his attorneys had begun weeks earlier continued after that hearing and eventually resulted in a separate action against Elton personally. But that would happen on its own timeline, outside that courtroom. Elton did not speak. He did not look at me. Judge Odom concluded the session and indicated her written determination would follow within the statutory period. She gathered her materials and left the bench. The room began to empty. Dorothea placed her hand briefly on my arm and said nothing. That was enough. I had not spoken a single word in that courtroom all morning. I had not needed to. Every word that needed saying had been written down years ago and filed in the correct order and placed on that table at the correct time. That was always how it was going to end. Judge Odom's written determination arrived 8 days after the hearing. Dorothea called me at 7:40 in the morning and read it to me over the phone in the same flat, precise tone she used for everything. I sat at my kitchen table with my coffee and I listened without interrupting. The determination was 43 pages long. Most of it was not drama. Most of it was documentation, citations, findings, timelines, references to records exchanged during discovery, and arguments made over months of proceedings. The conclusion occupied only a small portion of the document. The work that produced it filled the rest. Elton received the jointly held personal savings, his personal vehicle, a severance payment calculated according to the terms of his employment agreement, the standard formula written into the contract he had signed twice and renewed a third time without reading. The determination noted his 27 years of service and applied the formula accordingly. It was not a small amount. It was exactly what the contract said it would be, and not $1 more. He did not receive equity in Adam's funeral services. He did not receive a stake in the pre-need portfolio. He did not receive a claim on any of the 6 locations, a percentage of future revenue, or any portion of the cemetery parcel currently in development. The pre-need portfolio, held inside the original LLC predating the marriage, was confirmed as my separate property. The 31 investor relationships were noted in the determination as having originated from documented strategy authored by me. The constructive ownership claim had been withdrawn and was not addressed. The spite matter and the separate claims arising from that arrangement were noted as proceedings outside the scope of the determination and left for resolution elsewhere. Dorothea asked if I had questions. I told her I did not. I thanked her and I ended the call, and I sat for a while with my coffee going cold in front of me. The formal signing was 3 days later. I watched Elton across the table as the documents were processed. He looked like a man who had slept poorly for several weeks and had stopped expecting that to change. He signed where his attorney indicated. He did not look at me during the signing. When it was finished, he stood, buttoned his jacket with the particular automatic motion of a man performing composure, and walked out. I watched him through the glass of the building's front wall. He crossed the parking lot without stopping, without turning, without any of the gestures people make when they want to be seen leaving. He reached his vehicle, his personal vehicle, the one thing on the list that had always been his. And he got in, and he drove away, and I stood at that glass until he was no longer visible. I could not read his expression from where I stood. After a moment, I stopped trying. Celestine was outside with 2 cups of coffee, leaning against her car in the way she had leaned against things since we were young women who believed most problems were temporary. She handed me a cup, and we stood together and did not speak for a long time. The morning was warm, the way Houston mornings are warm. Immediately, completely, without apology. She asked me how I felt. I told her I felt like someone who had finished a very long piece of work. She nodded and drank her coffee, and that was enough. Waverly called that evening at 7:30. He had clearly prepared what he wanted to say, and I let him say it without interruption. He apologized for the call he had made before the proceedings, the one about family, the one with the rehearsed warmth. Then he apologized for the night of the anniversary dinner. He said he had laughed. He said he had been wrong. He said he was sorry. I knew he had laughed. I had seen his face in that room from the moment Elton's register changed. I had filed it and carried it, and it had never surprised me. I told Waverly I heard him. I told him I appreciated the call. I ended it. There are people who choose wrong and spend the rest of their lives being sorry about it. I have no quarrel with their sorrow. I simply have no room for it anymore. 3 months is not a long time. It is long enough. The renovation had taken 11 weeks. I had overseen it personally. Not the contractors, not the project manager, me. Every decision about that wing passed through my hands because some things are not meant to be delegated. The original building had good bones, the kind of structural integrity that holds across decades when the person who built the foundation understood that what they were making was meant to last. My mother had understood that. The building knew it. We called it the Vernell Adams Hall. I arrived an hour before the guests to walk through it alone. The room was set, chairs arranged, flowers on the tables, light coming through the new windows at the angle I had specified when I reviewed the architectural drawings in week 3. I stood in the center of it, and I turned slowly, and I let myself have that moment without rushing it. My mother had worked in this building for years, without a license, without a storefront name, without anything that the formal world would have recognized as a business. She had worked in it with her hands and her attention, and her absolute refusal to treat any grieving family as less than worthy of care. This room now had her name on it in letters cut from brushed steel above the entrance. That felt correct to me. It felt like something that had always been true finally being stated in a language the world could read. The guests arrived in the way community arrives. Not all at once, but steadily. The way people come when they have decided that something matters and they want to be present for it. Employees I had worked beside for 20 years. Families from the neighborhood whose people had been served in this building across 3 decades. A pastor who had known my mother. 2 city council members who had watched Adam's funeral services grow from a single location in the 3rd Ward into what it was now. And in the front row, seated early and sitting straight in the particular way she sat when she wanted you to know she was paying attention, Nettie Fraser. I had not told many people about the Cutler Foundation before that evening. What I said, standing at the front of the Vernell Adams Hall with those faces in front of me, was that Adams Funeral Services was formally reviving a charitable foundation that had gone dormant in 1987. That the foundation would provide funeral cost assistance to Houston families who could not afford dignified burial. That it would operate under its original name, the Cutler Foundation, as a permanent acknowledgement of a kindness extended across an unlikely distance that had made everything else possible. I did not explain the full history. The full history belonged to my mother, and I had already decided to keep it where she kept it, close, documented, private, and honored in action rather than in public narrative. What I saw in the room when I said it was recognition. Not of the Cutler name, most people there had no reason to know it. Recognition of the thing itself. The idea that dignity in death should not depend on what a family could afford. They knew that idea. They had lived inside it. My mother had built her life around it in composition books and quiet arrangements and a back room in this building where she worked without asking anyone's permission to be necessary. I was making it permanent. That was all. I was giving it a legal structure and a funded account and a name and the full weight of everything Adams Funeral Services had become. My mother started it with $22 and a bag of sweet potatoes. I was finishing it with 6 locations, a pre-need portfolio, a cemetery parcel in development, and a foundation that would still be operating long after every person in that room was gone. I stood in the doorway of the Vernell Adams Hall at the end of the evening, and I looked at what she had started and what I had finished, and I thought about every person who had ever doubted either of us. My mother started this with her hands, and nothing else. I finished it with everything she gave me. Let them look.